There was a dark time in Judah when the thirst for power overcame the limits of the fear of God. After the death of King Ahaziah, his mother, Athaliah, decided to take the throne for herself. Determined to eliminate any threat to her rule, she ordered the extermination of all royal descendants, including her own grandchildren. It was a cold and calculated slaughter. It seemed that the lineage of David would be extinguished right there. But in the midst of the horror, an act of bravery changed the course of history. Jehoshaphat, sister of the late king and wife of the priest Jehoiada, risked everything by hiding the little Joash, still a baby, from the assassins sent by Athaliah. She secretly took him to the temple of the Lord, a place the ruthless queen never dared to visit. It was there, within the sacred walls, that Joash found refuge, far from the throne that belonged to him, but close to the God who watched over his eternal plans. Subscribe to the channel to see more exciting biblical stories and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. For 6 long years, the boy grew up in secret, protected by Jehoiada and Jehoshaphat. The temple, which for many was just the center of worship, became a home for Joash. The voices of the priests, the chants, the teachings whispered in his ear formed the foundations of his soul. While the people lived under the cruel rule of Athaliah, the true heir grew in silence, waiting for the appointed time. No one imagined that behind the curtains of the holy place, a king was being formed. The throne seemed lost, the promise distant, but the God of Judah was silently writing a new page for his nation. The life of Joash was a miracle from the beginning, a faint thread of hope that resisted the darkness. In that sacred hiding place, not only was the child protected, but there too, far from applause and titles, the character of the future king began to be forged. The seed of faithfulness, humility, and obedience sprouted amidst the incense and prayers. The destiny of Joash was just beginning, and the moment when the world would know of his existence was fast approaching. Before continuing, I want to invite you to comment from which city or country you're watching this. Let's see how far this message reaches. The 7th year arrived like a dawn after a long night. Jehoiada, the priest who had secretly raised Joash in the temple, knew the time had come to act. The people of Judah were tired of Athaliah's rule, of the cruel impositions, and the estrangement from God. It was time to restore the lineage of David. But how to reveal to the world that there was a living heir, and that this heir was just a child? With wisdom and discernment, Jehoiada devised a bold plan. He gathered the leaders of the Levite families, the heads of the guard, and trusted men. To each, he revealed the secret kept for 7 years. The son of King Ahaziah was alive. Joash was the legitimate heir to the throne of Judah. The news spread like wildfire among the faithful. It was not just a political hope. It was a sign that God had not forgotten his people. On the appointed day, the temple became the stage for a historic moment. Amidst songs and trumpets, Jehoiada presented Joash to the crowd. There, on the steps of the temple, a 7-year-old boy received the crown and the testimony of the covenant. The people applauded, prostrated themselves, and wept with emotion. It was the return of God's promise, the rebirth of justice. Athaliah, hearing the outcry, ran to the temple. Seeing the crowned child, she shouted, "Treason!" But there was no longer room for her dominion. Jehoiada ordered her to be taken out and executed outside the temple, so as not to defile the holy place. Her reign ended there, not with glory, but with judgment. That same day, Jehoiada renewed the covenant between the people, the king, and the Lord. The temple was purified, the idols destroyed, and a new era began. Joash, at only 7 years old, became king of Judah, a child on the throne, but surrounded by men who feared God. And in the heart of everyone, there was a strong, new feeling, hope. If this content has touched your heart, you can support this project by donating any amount by clicking the Super Thanks button. Your support helps me continue telling these stories with dedication. The first years of Joash on the throne were marked by stability and order. Although he was too young to rule alone, his leadership was guided by the firm and pious presence of Jehoiada, the priest who had raised him from the cradle. Jehoiada's influence was not only political, but also spiritual. He not only taught the king the duties of the crown, but also showed him the way of the Lord day after day with patience and tenderness. The young king grew in wisdom and compassion, humbly absorbing the advice of those around him. There was no arrogance in Joash. He remembered where he had come from, how he had been saved, and that made him sensitive to the needs of the people. Under his initial leadership, Judah experienced times of peace, justice, and reverence. The Levites returned to their posts in the temple service. The sacrifices were re-established with order and zeal, and the sacred feasts were celebrated with joy and devotion. The people saw in that child king a sign of renewal. They felt secure, not because of military strength or accumulated wealth, but because of the certainty that justice and the fear of God were once again the pillars of the kingdom. Jehoiada, with wisdom, surrounded Joash with faithful and pious counselors. These were not flatterers, but men who sought the divine will before convenience. Together, they instructed the king in the ways of righteousness. And Joash listened attentively. He not only listened but obeyed. His decisions reflected a heart willing to learn and grow. Those early years were very valuable. It was then that the character of Joash was forged in the heat of truth and mercy. While other kingdoms sank into corruption and idolatry, Judah became an example of reverence. The presence of God was felt, and the fruits of a just government began to flourish. The people rejoiced. There was abundance in the harvests, harmony among the tribes, and, above all, hope for an even better future. The child king was growing, and with him grew the desire to restore what was still broken. Among those desires was something that weighed on his heart: the state of the temple, the house where it had all begun. Walking through the halls of the temple, Joash did not just see walls and columns. For him, that place was the living symbol of God's faithfulness. There he had grown up listening to the scriptures, smelling the aroma of the sacrifices, learning to distinguish good from evil. But as the years passed, the king began to notice the wear of the structures, the deterioration of the utensils, and the lack of zeal that once characterized that holy place. The once majestic temple now reflected the effects of neglect from previous generations. During the impious reigns that preceded him, many sacred objects had been taken, destroyed, or despised. This wounded Joash's heart. He knew that restoring the temple was not just a physical work, but an expression of honor to God. Determined, he summoned the priests and Levites and entrusted them with a mission: to gather the necessary resources for the renovation. The order was clear, but as time passed, no progress was seen. The priests, either out of fear or disorganization, did not complete the task. Joash then called Jehoiada and expressed his concern. He did not want the restoration to remain just in the planning stages. It was necessary to act. It was then that a new strategy was established. A special chest was placed at the entrance of the temple where the people could voluntarily bring their offerings. And they came. Men, women, and entire families brought silver and gold with joy because they felt they were participating in something sacred. It was more than donations. It was a movement of reconnection with God. With the resources finally available, Joash personally supervised the work. Artisans, carpenters, blacksmiths, and masons worked with dedication. Every replaced stone, every restored utensil was a step in rebuilding Judah's identity as God's people. The king's zeal was contagious to all around him. At the end of the renovation, the temple shone once again. The chants resonated with more force. The sacrifices ascended to the heavens with reverence, and the people felt once again in the presence of the Almighty. Joash had honored the house where he had been saved. It was a time of gratitude, reverence, and renewal. But what he did not yet know was that the days of stability were numbered, and that new decisions would test not only his government, but also his heart. Do you want to deepen your spiritual life? Click on the first comment and get your fasting and prayer guide now and transform your spiritual life. Discover the power of fasting and prayer to experience a true transformation. Jehoiada was already an old man when Joash ascended to the throne. For years he had served as a priest, counselor, and guardian of the royal line. His life had been marked by unwavering faithfulness and serene wisdom. It was he who kept the boy alive, who organized his coronation, and who guided the first steps of his reign. But relentless time also came for this man of God. When Jehoiada died, Judah mourned sincerely. His burial was honored among the kings, not for his royal blood, but for his spiritual greatness. His absence was like the collapse of foundation. Joash, now an adult, faced the challenge of walking without the one who had always been by his side. And it was in that moment of transition that the winds began to change. Without the firm presence of Jehoiada, the throne became surrounded by other counselors. Cunning men, skilled in flattery, but poor in the fear of God. They approached with soft words, exalting the king, offering modern advice, suggesting alliances with other peoples, and opening the doors to practices that were once condemned. Joash, without the spiritual structure that had sustained him for so long, began to yield. First subtly, a decision here, a concession there. But little by little, his sensitivity was suffocated. What once bothered him, he now accepted as normal. The memory of Jehoiada's teachings seemed to fade before the voices that surrounded him. The temple, which had been restored with such zeal, still stood, but the faithfulness surrounding it began to crumble. The old idols, once removed, found space in hidden corners. Strange sacrifices were again offered on distant hills, and the people, confused, followed the king's example. Joash had not become a cruel man. There were still traces of goodness in his heart, but he lacked discernment. He no longer distinguished what came from God and what came from men. The silence of his conscience reflected the void left by the one who had guided him since childhood. The loss of Jehoiada was more than the death of a friend. It was the breaking of a bond with the truth. And without realizing it, Joash was walking toward decisions that would tragically mark his history. With Jehoiada's absence, the silence that was once filled with wise counsel now resonated with voices full of vanity. The new leaders surrounding the throne did not come with fear, but with ambitions disguised as loyalty. And Joash, now more vulnerable than ever, began to be molded by these new influences. It was the princes of Judah who approached with subtlety. They came with gifts, with sweet words, exalting the king above all else. They spoke of freedom, of progress, of alliances with neighboring peoples. They brought seductive ideas, more accessible altars, mixed worship, images that represented divinity in a more attractive way. Joash listened, and what he once would have rejected firmly, he now accepted naturally. The worship of God began to mix with pagan practices. The altars of the Lord still existed, but they were no longer alone. Worship became confused, without purity, without reverence, and the people, as a mirror of their leaders, followed the same path. There were sacrifices in high places, rituals inherited from other nations, and a gradual forgetting of the covenant with the God of Israel. Joash no longer sought the divine presence. Decisions were made based on convenience, and the faithful priests, once listened to with respect, were now ignored. What had begun as a slight inclination had become a profound deviation. The king who had restored the temple now allowed the people to worship false gods. And what's worse, he turned a blind eye to injustices, the suffering of the poor, and the cry of the prophets. Judah was entering a spiritual decline. Abundance gave way to unrest. Families were divided between the tradition of the fathers and the new doctrines that were spreading. The people no longer celebrated with joy, but with fear and confusion. And Joash, although still sitting on the throne, no longer reigned with a heart full of light. Idolatry was not just a religious error. It was the evidence of a heart that was drifting away. The zeal of yesteryear had disappeared, replaced by a search for control, prestige, and acceptance. The king who had been raised in the temple now allowed the temple to be despised. But God would not remain silent in the face of this betrayal. There were still voices that would not bow, and one of them would soon rise with courage to remind the king where he came from and confront him with the truth he had forgotten. As spiritual darkness began to envelop Judah, God did not remain silent. In his mercy, he always raised up voices to call his people to repentance. And in that generation, the chosen voice came from a deeply symbolic place. It was Zechariah, son of Jehoiada, the same Jehoiada who had saved and raised Joash, a young prophet born in the temple, instructed in the ways of righteousness, with the same passion that had once moved his father. Zechariah watched with sadness the decline of the nation. He saw how pagan altars were being erected, how the people were drifting away, and how the temple that had meant so much was being treated as a commonplace. But what hurt him most was what was happening to Joash. That king he had known as a child, full of fear and reverence, had now become someone distant, hardened, confused. Moved by an unshakable conviction, Zechariah raised his voice before the people and the king. He did not mince words. He clearly rebuked the sin of Judah, denounced idolatry, and called everyone to return to the covenant with the Lord. He was direct. Why do you transgress the commandments of the Lord, so that you cannot prosper? His words cut like swords, but they were loaded with truth and mercy. The hope was that Joash would recognize the voice of heaven, remember Zechariah's father, and repent. But the king was no longer the same. Upon hearing the rebuke, he felt not remorse, but affront. The counselors surrounding him incited him against the prophet, interpreting his words as a threat, not a warning. Joash made a decision that would profoundly mark his history. He authorized the execution of Zechariah, ordering him to be stoned in the courtyard of the temple, the very place where the king himself had been crowned. The ground that had been consecrated with celebration was now stained with the blood of rejected justice. Before he died, Zechariah uttered one last sentence, not of revenge, but of warning. May the Lord see and avenge. And then silence reigned again. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence that precedes judgment. The death of Zechariah was more than a personal tragedy. It was the symbol of Joash's definitive break with everything he had learned, with everything that had formed him. The king had rejected the truth, and the price of that choice would soon begin to be paid. The blood of Zechariah was still crying out from the ground when the first signs of judgment began to manifest. The peace that Judah had known in the early years of Joash's reign was interrupted by unexpected conflicts. Neighboring nations, once weakened, now rose with force against Jerusalem. It was as if an invisible protection had been removed, leaving the kingdom exposed, vulnerable, without direction. A numerically inferior Syrian army invaded Judah and inflicted harsh defeats. Experienced soldiers fell before a seemingly weak enemy. The capital was plundered, the princes were killed, and Joash, severely wounded, was humiliated. It was not just a military defeat, it was a spiritual warning. The people, once confident, now murmured. The faces that had exalted the king turned into faces of fear and disappointment. Many began to wonder in silence, has the Lord abandoned us? But the answer was more painful. It was not God who abandoned them. It was the king who turned away. As Joash recovered from his wounds in his bed, the palace fell silent. The corridors that once resonated with just decisions were now filled with insecurity and intrigue. The servants walked with their heads down, and the priests no longer found space to express themselves. The king, once admired for his zeal, was now viewed with mistrust and contempt. The suffering of Judah was not random. It was the direct consequence of idolatry, injustice, and the rejection of God's prophet. The Lord had allowed Joash to experience the result of his choices. The throne trembled, not for lack of soldiers, but for the absence of spiritual foundations. In the privacy of the royal chamber, Joash had time to reflect, but even there, wounded and alone, he did not seek repentance. The heart that had once been tender had now hardened. There were no tears, no confession, no turning back. And as if that were not enough, the king would be betrayed by those who served him. Two of his own officials, indignant at what he had done to Zechariah and dissatisfied with his government, conspired against him. They were not seeking personal revenge, but justice, or at least an end to the reign of a man who had forgotten his roots. The final blow was near, and with it, the melancholy end of a story that had begun with so much hope. On the night Joash was assassinated, there was no public mourning or prayers in his memory. Wounded, weak, and isolated, he succumbed at the hands of his own servants, men who had once pledged obedience to him, but could no longer bear the weight of his betrayal. The death of Zechariah was still alive in the national consciousness, and many saw in this final act the fulfillment of the prophet's warning. Joash died far from glory, far from the honor that marks the end of just kings. He was not buried among the kings of Judah, nor was his name celebrated. The songs that once joyfully announced his coronation were now silenced by shame. The child who had once been miraculously saved, who had grown up in the temple, and who had reigned with such pure promise, ended his life as a rejected king. There was no procession. The people who once applauded him now forgot him. His memory was stained not only by his mistakes, but by his stubbornness in not turning back. He had opportunities to repent. God warned him, showed him mercy, and protected him in his early years. But by choosing to ignore all that, Joash lost not only the protection of heaven, but also the admiration of the earth. His story, which began with the rescue of a baby in the midst of death, ended with the execution of a king in the midst of contempt. Between these extremes, he lived the consequences of a heart that turned away from the source of life. Joash had everything to be remembered as a restorer, a man of faith, an example, but he chose paths that led him away from his purpose. The people of Judah moved on. Other kings would come with their own flaws and virtues, but the memory of Joash served for generations as a solemn warning. A good start does not always guarantee a worthy end. It is necessary to remain faithful, even when spiritual guides depart, even when the path seems uncertain. The tragedy of Joash was having forgotten where he came from and who had sustained him in his days of fragility. And when the beginning of the journey is forgotten, the end tends to deviate from the destiny God had traced. The story of Joash is a tale marked by deep contrasts. A miraculous beginning, a youth surrounded by faith and education, and a reign that had everything to be memorable for its faithfulness. But it tragically ended in ruin, not for lack of opportunities, but for deliberate decisions of estrangement. The first lesson his life teaches us is the importance of good influences. As long as he was by Jehoiada's side, Joash prospered. He followed advice, maintained zeal, and did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. This reminds us how God uses the people around us to strengthen, teach, and guide us. However, it also warns us, when we lose those references, it is essential to keep the personal foundations of faith firm. Joash did not know how to walk alone, and that is why he fell. Another profound lesson is the danger of a heart that becomes accustomed to God's favor but does not remain grateful. Joash forgot who raised him, who kept him in the temple, who crowned him. Ingratitude and spiritual forgetfulness open the way to idolatry, pride, and finally, tragedy. A lack of gratitude hardens the heart and erases the memory of divine mercies. We also learn that God always gives us opportunities to return. The voice of Zechariah was one of those opportunities, a cry of warning, a final bridge. But Joash chose to destroy the prophet, and with that he broke the bridge back. When we reject correction, we harden our hearts against God himself. We need to cultivate a spirit willing to learn, even when the truth confronts us. Finally, the trajectory of Joash reminds us that it is not enough to start well. Faithfulness must be cultivated to the end. A godly life is not built only on past experiences, but on daily decisions to remain in God, even when the voices around us say otherwise. In the Christian walk, many begin with zeal, enthusiasm, and good intentions, but those who persevere to the end are those who keep their eyes fixed on the Lord, regardless of losses, influences, or circumstances. Joash had everything to be remembered with honor, but he chose a path that led him away from the truth. His story remains as a mirror for each of us, so that with fear and vigilance, we do not lose focus on the one who saved and called us. If you like the story of Joash and want to continue reading other stories of faith and overcoming, don't forget to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.